My dear friends, today we celebrate the 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time Year C, and also the feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica in Rome, the oldest and highest ranking of the four major basilicas in Rome. This feast reminds us that the true dwelling place of God is not made of stone and bricks, but is found in the hearts of His people, in whom the Spirit lives and works. Today's first reading from the prophet Ezekiel gives us a powerful image of hope, a river flowing from the temple of God. Ezekiel saw water trickling out from beneath the temple threshold. Small at first, but as it flowed further, it became a deep and mighty river. Wherever the river went, life appeared. Trees grew, fish multiplied, and even the salty, lifeless waters became fresh. To understand this vision, we need to know the context. The people of Israel were in exile. Their beloved city Jerusalem lay in ruins. The temple, the very sign of God's presence, had been destroyed. They felt abandoned and lifeless like a dry desert. Yet in that darkness, God gives this vision, a new temple, and from it a stream of life. God is saying, I have not forgotten you. My presence will return and life will flow again. The river from the temple is a symbol of God's grace and spirit. What begins as a small trickle becomes a flood of life. It reminds us that God's work often begins quietly, in prayer, in small acts of kindness and forgiveness, but it grows and transforms everything it touches. Where God's grace flows, death gives way to life. Bitterness turns to sweetness and barrenness becomes fruitful. Ezekiel also speaks of trees that grow along the banks of this river, trees that bear fruit every month, whose leaves bring healing. This is an image of the Christian life. When we remain rooted in God, nourished by His presence, we too can bear fruit in every season. Love, joy, patience, mercy. And our lives can bring healing to others. Each of us is called to be part of that river. God's Spirit flows through us into the dry places of our world, our families, our workplaces, our communities. Consider where God might be inviting you to let His Spirit flow in your life. Even small beginnings, a trickle, can become rivers of transformation, blessing others as well as yourself. The reading invites us not only to receive God's life, but to let it flow out from us, bringing hope and healing wherever we go. The fruitfulness and healing are not just for us, but meant to overflow into the world. May we be channels of God's living water, allowing His grace to renew all that is dry and barren in our lives and communities. In the second reading taken from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, Paul uses a powerful image to describe the church and each believer. He says, "You are God's building," reminding the Corinthians that their faith is not their own doing, but something built carefully on the foundation that God has already laid, Jesus Christ. Paul sees himself as a builder who has laid the foundation through preaching the gospel, but he insists that no one can lay a better foundation than Christ Himself. Everything in our Christian life must rest upon Him. The church in Corinth was facing division and pride. Some believers claimed to follow Paul, others Apollos, and others Peter. To correct them, Paul uses the image of a building to stress unity. Different people may help build the church through teaching, service, or prayer. but all must build on the same foundation: Christ's love, truth, and sacrifice. Without him, everything else crumbles. Then Paul goes even deeper. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? This is not just poetic language, it is a truth about who we are. Every Christian and the community as a whole is a dwelling place of God. The Holy Spirit lives within us, making our hearts a sacred temple. That's why Paul warns, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. He's reminding us how serious it is to harm the church or another person through gossip, division, or sin. This passage invites us to reflect on two things. First, what kind of building am I helping to construct in my faith community? One built on Christ or on ego and comparison? And second, do I truly see myself and others as temples of the Holy Spirit? If God's Spirit dwells in us, then our lives, words, and relationships should reflect holiness, unity, and love. Let us guard this temple carefully and build our lives on Christ, our sure foundation. A young boy from a rural area once visited a beautiful church in the city with his parents. As they entered, he exclaimed, "Wow, this is God's house." But as the Mass went on, he saw people chatting, scrolling on their phones, and rushing out before the final hymn. And later he asked, if this is God's house, why does it feel like nobody's home? That innocent question captures something Jesus felt when he entered the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was meant to be a place of prayer, where people could encounter God. But what he found was noise, business, and greed. The sacred space had turned into a marketplace. In a burst of righteous anger, Jesus made a whip of cords and drove out the merchants, overturning tables and scattering coins. He cried out, "Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." This shocking moment is not about violence, but about zeal, a passionate love for God's presence. Jesus' actions revealed that worship had lost its heart. Religion had become routine, and the temple was being used for profit instead of prayer. When Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," he was pointing to himself. His body would become the new temple, the true dwelling place of God among us. We must ask ourselves, what would Jesus cleanse in our church today? Perhaps he would challenge our indifference when we treat faith as a habit instead of a relationship. Maybe he would overturn the tables of clericalism, where authority is used for power instead of service. He might call for synodality, a church that listens, walks together, and gives a greater voice to all, especially women, whose gifts and leadership must be valued. Jesus would also remind us that the poor are not guests in the church, they are its heart. The gospel always begins at the margins, and surely he would cleanse the deep wounds caused by abuse, calling us to truth, justice, and healing. The cleansing of the temple is an invitation. God, Jesus, invites us to let God's love overturn anything in our hearts that hinders worship, justice, or compassion. Are we ready to let Jesus enter the temple of our hearts, overturn what is false, and restore what is holy? When we allow Him to cleanse us, the church becomes again what it was always meant to be: a house where God truly feels at home. May God bless us all.